Welcome to Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety, where we talk about the real issues out on the road, focus on safe driving, and learn industry best practices from your hosts Kenny Ray, Mike Bohan, and Jim Seibert, in the hopes that by driving the line, we get more drivers home safe and sound. This podcast was made possible by Marsh McLennan Agency.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Driving the Line, the trucking podcast that is always in the pursuit of safety. This is Mike Bohan, along with my friends and co-hosts Kenny Ray and Jim Seibert, and we are extremely glad to be with you today. And we've got a very important topic that we're going to be discussing during today's episode. And when we started this podcast, we made a commitment that we would talk about all things trucking and that we would always do so in the vein of focusing on transportation safety. So the topic that we're going to be discussing today is hours of service. And we're specifically going to take a look at the most recent changes regarding the sleeper berth provision, 30-minute break requirement, the short haul exception, and the adverse driving conditions exception.
Even though those changes became effective in September 2020, there's still a tremendous amount of confusion within the trucking industry about who, what, when, and where the changes apply.
You're 100% right, Jim. And that's why we're going to take some time today to discuss the applicability and the best practices of these changes to a motor carrier's operation. Now, Kenny, as you've been out traveling and meeting with clients, it's probably become apparent that some of these changes are a little more confusing than others. Am I right?
No doubt about it, Mike. And the one that I find that motor carriers and drivers are most confused about are the changes to the sleeper berth provisions, particularly the split sleeper berth. What FMCSA did, they came in and changed the previous rule that allowed motor carriers to allow drivers to split their 10-hour break, their off-duty time, as long as one of the periods was in the sleeper, and they could split it in what drivers always called 8 and 2. They could take 8 hours in the sleeper and then 2 hours at another time and still meet the 10 hours. And to respond really to some pressure from industry for a little more flexibility in that, FMCSA came back and did allow some flexibility in that. So now what they do is they allow the drivers to take their required 10-hour off-duty period in 2 separate periods. And they basically changed the 8 and 2 to a 7 and 3 or any combination thereof. Now, where this gets confusing, and we talked about how some of these changes were confusing, is in the language that FMCSA used. Because what they said when they actually issued the change to the regulation, they said that you could split the 2 periods into 2 periods, provided that one of the off-duty periods was at least 2 hours long, and the other off-duty period was at least 7 consecutive hours spent in the sleeper. So what happened was drivers look at that and they say, well, 2 and 7 equals 9. So now if I take 2 hours off and 7 hours off, have I met my off-duty time? And the answer to that is no. The periods must still add up to 10 hours. So they can take 7, and then they can take 3, or they can take 7.5 and 2.5, or they can go back and do the 8 and 2. What they can't do are things like 5 and 5, which equals 10. But there you would have one of the 5 and 5. One of the periods wouldn't meet the 7-hour rule. They can't do a 6 and 4 for the very same reason. They could not do a 9 and 1, even though that equals 10, because one of them has to be at least 2 hours long. So the confusing part about it comes both a combination of the language that FMCSA used when they wrote the reg, and also the fact that this one involves some mathematic calculations, and that tends to be confusing for not just for truck drivers or motor carriers, but for a lot of people, particularly if you're trying to do it in your head. Which leads me to say that if a motor carrier is going to choose to do this, and Mike, let's stress that, and I think you will probably on some of these other ones as well, these changes, it's the motor carrier's choice. It's not arbitrarily a driver's choice to do this. The motor carrier must decide, yay or nay, we're going to allow our drivers to use the split sleeper berth provision. And if they do, and if the motor carrier operates using an ELD, and the vast majority of motor carriers now are using ELDs, then I always encourage folks, let the ELD do the math. Let the ELD tell you if you've met the 7 and 3 or the 8 and 2 or whatever combination you're going to do thereof. It's when drivers try to do it in their head that they end up in trouble. And the next thing you know, you got a false log and they're getting stopped at the scales and getting put out of service. The one other thing I would add about the split sleeper is that neither of the time periods now counts against the 14-hour rule, as long as they're both used together. That has been a huge help in terms of flexibility on dispatching drivers, when drivers take their breaks. So the things I would want folks to remember is that the carrier gets to choose. Let the ELD do the math for you. The order is irrelevant. You can take the short break first and then the long one. You can take the long one first and then the short one. As long as you combine the two of them and they equal 10 hours, then neither one of them will count against the 14-hour rule. Where it gets tough on the trying to manually calculate whether or not you're in compliance is if you're doing it on a paper log and you're trying to go back and figure, okay, when do I start my next 11-hour run? When do I start my next 14 hours? When does all that happen? So again, if nobody remembers anything else from the sleeper berth provision, just remember this: if you're running an ELD, let the ELD do the math for you.
Absolutely. And this is an important one because I have seen companies go through a DOT audit and they've had one driver out of their bunch that didn't understand exactly how to do this. And it caused an adverse rating on the audit because they had then critical violations because the driver just was in violation every day they used this split sleeper. So it's an extremely important one there. The next change, and probably one of the least confusing of all the revisions, is the 30-minute break requirement. Jim, if you wouldn't mind, could you let our listeners know how that was modified and how it applies to them?
Sure thing, Mike. I've heard this 30-minute break change described as a motor carrier friendly. And the gist of it is any non-driving activity for 30 consecutive minutes per 8 hours of driving. Under the previous rule, it was 8 hours on duty. Under the new rule, it's 8 hours driving with a 30-minute break. Under the previous rule, you could only take that 30-minute break. It could only be satisfied by off-duty time or in sleeper berth. New rule, it can be satisfied by off-duty, in sleeper berth, or on-duty, not driving. So think of this situation. Driver shows up to the yard, discovers they have a flat tire. Under the old rule, the time it took to fix that flat tire and get that driver on the road was considered on duty, and a 30-minute break, 30 consecutive minute break was required even though the driver was not operating the tractor trailer. So under the new rule, that maintenance, that tire change is not considered on driving or while driving for the 8 hours that would require the 30-minute break.
Yeah, definitely driver friendly. And in that situation, other situations when drivers are coming in, maybe to get fuel, and they're there for 30 minutes or longer, now they can utilize that time, on duty time, not driving, as their 30-minute break. So definitely a driver friendly change to the rule there. So that's always a good one for our drivers and our motor carrier friends. Now, Kenny, one of the regulations that saw the most significant change was that to the short haul exception. So what kind of changes did we see there?
Yeah, they were significant. And just like Jim mentioned about the 30-minute break being motor carrier friendly, all of the motor carriers I know that are exercising the short haul exception have found this rule to be very friendly for them as well. And Mike, I know you're in Missouri and Jim's in Oklahoma, but at least in Texas, we are seeing a lot of motor carriers use the short haul exception. Basically, what the short haul exception does is allow a motor carrier that operates within 150 mile circle of their yard or their location. We can talk about that in just a moment, where the drivers go out and come back to the same starting and ending location every day. They do that within 14 hours, and then they take 10 hours off between, they're exempt from logging. They don't have to log at all. We're not talking about not having to use ELD and go into paper. We're talking about they don't have to log. There's no record of duty status requirement. They're also exempt from having to keep supporting documents for the logs. They're also exempt from 30-minute break. So basically what we see is that a motor carrier that chooses to do this, they will either get on Google Maps, or in Texas, we still use paper map. They'll get an old-fashioned paper map, and they simply draw a 150-mile circle, and it's air miles, which actually comes out to about 172 land miles. But they'll draw that circle around their yard, and as long as their drivers operate within the confines of that circle, and they leave from and come back to the yard within 14 hours, and they do that with 10 hours off between duty times, then they're exempt from logging, they're exempt from supporting documentation, and they don't have to take the 30-minute break. Now, the change for this for us was the old rule was 100 miles. So now it's been extended out to 150. And the old rule was they had to leave and come back within 12 hours. Now they've got 14 hours, the same as an over-road driver does on their 14-hour window. Now, I have a lot of motor carriers that ask a couple of questions. Okay, if we start doing this, but one day we bust, which means we either go over the 150-mile circle, or we're out longer than 14 hours, or for whatever reason, my driver starts in some location and we end him in another, what do we do? And that's a good question. And what they do is they log that day. And as long as they do that less than 8 days in any 30-day period, they can log those, I'm going to call them one-offs. They can log those one-offs on paper. Now, if they hit the magic 8 days within a 30-day period, even using the short haul, if they're going to have to log 8 times within a 30-day period, then they're going to have to go to an ELD. For the motor carrier, they have to keep time records on the drivers that are using the short haul exception. It's got to record when that driver came to work, what time that driver got off, and the total amount of time they were on duty for that day. And there's one other little provision, and we're actually seeing this used quite a bit in Texas, particularly in West Texas with our oil field operations, but I could see it applying in certain other industries as well. But where that the motor carrier establishes basically a temporary terminal. I'll just use an example. Let's say that a motor carrier is out of Houston, Texas, but they're going to have 15 trucks operating in West Texas for a certain period of time. And they just arbitrarily pick a truck stop in Odessa, Texas, and they say, this is going to be our yard for the next amount of time. They declare that as the starting and stopping location for their drivers. So their drivers basically all park the trucks at this truck stop in Odessa, Texas. They leave out in the morning and they go haul frac sand, or they go haul pipe, or they go haul whatever they're going to haul in the oil field in West Texas. They get back within 14 hours. They don't go outside the 150-mile circle, and they take 10 hours off between duty times. Then they get to count that even though they're at a different location. Okay, so FMCSA has recognized that. The one place where motor carriers have to be careful, and we see this constantly in oil field operations particularly, is when the motor carrier decides to move that temporary location. Let's say they're going to move it from Odessa to Pecos, Texas. Well, that trip, that day that they make the move to the new location, they have to log that day. And so I guess what I would say, Mike, is that for companies that are thinking about using the short haul exception, particularly if you're going to do it with remote locations away from your main yard, reach out to your safety professional and make sure you fully understand all the ramifications. Don't just arbitrarily think, well, we don't have to log anymore because we're going to operate within this 150-mile circle. Remember the 3 provisions: 150 miles, out and back within 14 hours, and out and back to the same location. And then you got to take 10 hours off between duty shifts. And again, just like we talked both with the sleeper berth and the 30-minute break, and I know you're going to discuss adverse driving conditions in a moment. It's always up to the carrier. The carrier doesn't have to do this, but some of them are choosing to do it. And it's not a driver's choice, it's a motor carrier choice. And but we're seeing, and Mike, you can tell me what's going on in Missouri, but I'm seeing a lot of Texas motor carriers that are using this one. One thing interesting, that there's a lot of safety organizations that are against all of these changes, particularly the sleeper berth in this one. They don't like drivers being able to run without having to display logs. But right now, this is the rule. Motor carriers are using it, and it never, ever exempts a motor carrier from being safe and drivers making sure they're not fatigued. But right now, this is the rule, the short haul exception, and at least for the motor carriers using it, they're very pleased with the changes that FMCSA made to this particular reg.
Yeah, absolutely. And here in Missouri, we're seeing that as well, Kenny, and I'm seeing it in a couple different ways. I mean, I live in a rural area, and there's companies out here that maybe they haul rock or sand or whatever in dump trucks, and they're running that every day. They're running within that 150 air mile radius, starting in the day at the same place. They've got that time period that they're operating throughout the day, so they're utilizing it. But we're seeing it in the cities as well, in the metro areas. I've got customers that I work with that they may have an over-the-road fleet that is logging their miles normally every day, but then they have a local division as well that's utilizing this local haul option that they've got. So yes, it's important to know the requirements of the rule to make sure that your drivers remain in compliance with the regulations. So again, I like that you're bringing that up, Kenny, with each provision that we're going through, that it's the motor carrier's choice, not the driver's. So it's important that the motor carriers know the rules and that they're guiding their drivers and that they're giving them some guidance on how they utilize the rules. So the final change we're going to take a look at was to the adverse driving conditions exception. So the first thing we need to do is take a look at what an adverse driving condition is, because the definition changed with the rule change. Now, an adverse driving condition simply means it's a condition that presents snow, ice, sleet, fog, or other adverse weather conditions that were not known or could not reasonably be known to the driver immediately prior to beginning the duty day or immediately prior to beginning driving after a qualifying rest period. Or the adverse conditions were not known or could not reasonably be known to a motor carrier immediately prior to dispatching the driver. Now, it's important to make it clear that the adverse conditions were not known or could not reasonably have been known to the motor carrier and the driver, because this was a change from the previous rule. So adverse driving conditions are not going to include the things like rush hour traffic, which we can expect if we're in the cities, a bad weather front that was known to be coming through that was forecasted, any loading or unloading delays. These are things that are not going to be considered in this adverse driving condition exception. Now, when there is an unforeseen adverse driving condition that affects a driver's route and they cannot safely complete their run within the maximum drive time or the on-duty time that's allowed by the regulations, they can extend their 11-hour drive time and their 14-hour on-duty time by 2 additional hours. This inclusion of the 14-hour on-duty time extension was another big change in the adverse driving conditions exception, because that wasn't present in the previous rules. So the goal of the extension of both of these, the 11-hour rule and the 14-hour rule, the goal of the extension is to allow the driver time to either complete their run safely or to find a safe location for themselves, their equipment, and their cargo. And any driver that uses this exception is going to want to go into their logs and indicate when they used it, why the exception was used, and be able to explain that if they're stopped roadside. And as with any exception that we're talking about today, and Kenny's talked about this, and as we've gone through all of these 4 areas that we've outlined here for you today, as with any exception, the burden of being in compliance falls on the driver and the motor carrier that they're operating for. So it's important that you have a very, very good understanding of not only the regulations, but the exceptions to the regulations to help keep your driver safe and your company in compliance with the hours of service regulations. Now, before we wrap up this episode, Jim, Kenny, I want to give you both an opportunity to share any closing thoughts you have for our listeners Jim, I'll open it up to you, and then we'll give the floor to Kenny.
Thanks, Mike. I don't have anything profound, but in the world of regulatory affairs, it's nice when flexibility is built into the rules. The guidance we discussed today from the FMCSA, it appears that they built flexibility and provided us that.
Mike, I just want to reiterate, and it goes along really with what Jim just said about the fact, and you've stressed it, but my closing thought is to remember that motor carriers get to decide whether or not they're going to use these 4 changes to the regs. The only one that I've seen universally accepted, I've seen nobody choose not to use the 30-minute break. I mean, that has just become the new norm for us, that any non-driving time now satisfies that requirement. But the other 3, the split sleeper berth, the short haul exception, and the adverse driving conditions, those are all left to the discretion of the motor carrier. And so I just want the trucking companies out there that are listening to us to realize you get to make that decision, and you assume both the liability and the convenience of doing so if you do make that choice. But a lot of drivers think that they get to pick and not the motor carrier. And I just want to stress that ultimately it's the company's responsibility, because ultimately they are responsible for safety of their operation.
Absolutely. And to our listeners out there, if you need any additional information about the hours of service changes, please reach out to your risk consultant. Now, in the next episode of Driving the Line, we're going to continue our discussion of the hours of service regulations as we take a look at the guidance that the FMCSA has provided us on the use of personal conveyance. Until then, for my co-host Jim Seibert and Kenny Ray, I'm Mike Bohan. Stay safe, and thank you for joining us on Driving the Line, the podcast that is always in the pursuit of safety.
That's all the time we have for this episode of Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety. We hope you enjoyed our discussion, and thank you for listening. You can rate, review, and subscribe to Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or any other app you're using. You can also follow Marsh McLennan Agency on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Until next time, thanks again for listening. Drive safely, everyone.